So we're now moving to the panel part of this session. Please make note of any questions you may have, because after these last two brief presentations, there'll be a time for the audience members to come up to the microphones. Our first discussant is Dr. Michael Horberg, Executive Director for Research, Community Benefit, and Medical Strategy at the Kaiser Permanentes Group. He was introduced earlier already.
So thank you. Just a few probably random thoughts, and really glad I followed Marcus. I don't want to de-emphasize at all the issue of mutual trust. And trust comes from experience and experience working together. And you can't just throw people together and say, create a new car. It really takes time. I mean, it's a lot of collaborations. I mean, in the KP system, we have taken years to work collaboratively with a variety of systems, including former Group Health, now our brethren, Harvard Pilgrim earlier, and now we are working closely in Mid-Atlantic with Johns Hopkins. You know, Dan and I are working closely together to create a Learning Health Systems Research Institute. So it's very germane to the issue. And I think groups like this, convening and meeting groups together, whether it be this group, I've been very involved for years, and Veronica Miller's here, the Executive Director, Forum for Collaborative Research. I think these groups, bringing these disparate parties together to start to create interfaces and to handle the thorny issues goes a long way. And no matter what we do with new methods, and I will actually argue that integrated health systems like mine are very comfortable using electronic health record data, even at the very nitty-gritty level of it, understanding the limitations. It still does not mean we compromise scientific principles. Internal validity versus generalizability. Jeff Martin from UCSF taught me the first day of EPI. But it is exciting to use new methods and curate new variables and learn how to handle missingness, which is something we haven't really talked about today, but in observational cohort data, that is a real issue. It's not nice and clean. But, you know, I think that we can also really from this, learn the new statistical methods, use them right. Let's not forget Bonferroni. And that becomes a real issue, especially as we start talking about genetics data. I can find an association if you want me to. But always, I think it's also easier to dismiss than to adopt and adapt. And I think with using these, using real-world evidence, we can really learn how to handle it, understand it, and use it correctly. I think, in fact, it will open up whole new areas of research. And frankly, I think both junior and senior scientists, as we know, will start to embrace it better because it leads you down paths of discovery. So that was just really the points I wanted to make.
Thank you. And we can then move to the last discussant, Anna McAlister-Slip, Chief Advocate for Participatory Research at the Scripps Translational Science Institute and founder of VitalCrowd and co-founder of Galileo. Anna.
Hi, it's such a true pleasure and honor to be here. And I'll start a little bit by telling you how I ended up in this room. I know Sharon talked a little bit about this earlier, but I come to this very much as a patient turned entrepreneur. So my background is in journalism and public affairs. 31 years ago, I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. It's always been very difficult to control. I have considerable glycemic variability, and despite being incredibly adherent, doing all the right things, being very up on all the technology, I still have all the complications from diabetes. So I'm somebody who I'm now up to 16 different medications. I use 11 different devices, 8 of which pretty much every day. None of the data connects. Most of the devices don't have open APIs. A lot of the medications require pre-certification and pre-approvals based on specific isolated outcomes measures that may or may not have anything to do with anything else that's going on with me clinically. So as a result of this, and as a result of living with what I would call the insidious consequences of crudely defined outcomes measures, namely hemoglobin A1C for diabetes, which I always say is a little bit like using the Farmer's Almanac to plan your afternoon, or hemoglobin for anemia. I take an Aranesp, an erythropoietin drug, and to get access to that, I get blood work done. They look at the hemoglobin level, and they don't look at anything else. So I'm currently going on 5, almost 6 months without my Aranesp because my hemoglobin level was above 11.0 and therefore deemed medically necessary, despite the fact that everything else in my blood panel would suggest that I was dehydrated and therefore it was inflated. So as a result, my doctor prescribes Ritalin to help me with energy issues. What's the cardiovascular benefit of that versus giving me actually access to blood oxygen through hemoglobin that's actually an appropriate number? So a few years ago, as a result of this, as a frustrated patient with a background in public affairs, I joined up with a friend and co-founded a company called Galileo Analytics, which is all around taking real-world evidence, putting it into a platform that's easy, fast, agile, and creating a platform on top of it to make it easy to play with and mine, et cetera. Through that, I got involved in digital health. I started, as somebody who lives in Washington, started getting invited to come to panels like this. I'm sort of a policy nerd, getting included on various issues related to that. And then more recently teamed up with the Scripps Translational Science Institute to create this platform around crowdsourcing the design of clinical research, which in large part was motivated by the fact that, despite the fact that because I'm not, I rarely meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria for clinical trials. I've never really been involved with one up until a few years ago. I'd always wondered why people dropped out of them until I lived with the clinical trial protocol for about 10 minutes, and then I knew why everybody dropped out of them. And not only that, but it was incredibly informative in a number of ways, in the sense that I realized that most of the questions that were being asked, you know, having sort of this meta-level awareness as somebody involved in the research space, most of the questions were asked were completely irrelevant to what they were actually studying. They were for health economic outcomes research, which is important, but not particularly appropriate. And after about 6 days of doing handwritten diaries, recording data that was already structured, machine readable, and answering these various questionnaires, I realized that probably like me, the other people in the study, like me, were probably just rushing through their diary to get it done. And I started having real doubts about the validity of the data that's actually collected. Even in and of itself, is the stuff that people are writing down in a randomized controlled trial actually valid? Does it actually mean something? Do the patients have enough vested interest, in the sense that you have enough vested interest in what they're doing to enter the data correctly and accurately, let alone the fact that randomized controlled trials of people with, you know, chronic kidney disease related anemia, if you're going to get a group of patients that are large enough to reflect that particular disease state, most of those patients are not going to look like me, and they're not going to want to go to the gym 5 times a week, as opposed to, you know, make it to church or family reunions or functions once a week. So there's a real imperative, and I would say that from my perspective as somebody who's a multi-layered nerd, clearly I have career ADD, there are a number of barriers that I've encountered both as a patient and entrepreneur that I think we really need to figure out how to get around. And some of them have already been mentioned, I won't belabor them, but there's a real bias towards the way things have always been done. And there are lots of different layers of fighting that I've personally had to take on, from the institutional bias, whether it's FDA or NIH or NCATS or whatever. Once you break through and you get through the leaders of those institutions convinced that this is the right thing to do, then you have to deal with the reviewers. And I've submitted several different grant applications with organizations that are government funded. All of them are represented in this room, where the leadership is incredibly supportive. So this is exactly what we need for this particular thing. And when it makes it through the reviewers are so conservative and so predisposed towards giving high scores to things that are similar to what they've seen or things that look familiar, that the scores actually aren't high enough to even make it through to get funded. Even though people want to fund it, it's not fundable because the reviewers have an existing bias. So we need to figure out how we're going to fix that. And just inviting patients to come in who have no real context in clinical trials to volunteer their time to sift through stacks of NIH or PCORI grants for maybe an Amazon gift card if you're lucky, that isn't the answer. We need to find a better way. There's a lack of access to the data once it's collected. The people who are looking at the data once it's been collected are also schooled in the same schools that the people who structured the trials. So there's a real bias towards looking at things the traditional way and not really bringing in insight and expertise from other fields of study that would force the people, in this room who have incredibly important perspectives to think differently about what the data means. I would argue that people like me, and there are way more people like me out there than a lot of people in Washington like to think, would be one of the easiest and most appropriate ways of beginning to change the paradigm for how these things are considered, how they're constructed, and how they're implemented, both from a regulatory perspective as well as from a construction of a study perspective. I could go on about this for quite some time, and I'll save that for the happy hour that Rob's looking forward to, apparently. But ultimately, I think, there are lots of different things that I could cite as potential solutions, but ultimately, I think one of the biggest barriers is a lack of a sense of urgency. We need to figure this out. And there are real consequences to the fact that we're over-relying on randomized controlled trials, that we have, for very understandable reasons, very rational reasons, we are stuck in a paradigm that we're accustomed to. It's a paradigm that served us very well, but it doesn't make sense to exclude all of these other sources of evidence. How do we begin to crack that? A lot of people in this room have spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. I've done some brilliant work. We're beginning to understand it. But we need to understand from a regulatory perspective, we need to give regulators the ability and the freedom to be able to take some risks in the types of data that they're looking at, to create sort of a regulatory sandbox of sorts to allow both the regulators, the patients, the companies, everybody involved to come together in a non-threatening way and say, maybe an accelerometer attached to your hip would be way more effective in determining whether or not you've got a cardiovascular risk from an erythropoietin drug, as opposed to an isolated hemoglobin level completely devoid of the context of the rest of your CBC. Or what are the best ways of collecting that data? And if there's one thing that we've seen in the type 1 diabetes community, it's that patients, as they get access to data and fluent with data, understand that data better than physicians and the researchers. And we're beginning to see evidence of that trickle into the design of research and crowdsourcing of research and tools using this data. But I think we're going to see that a lot more. And I think we could see that a lot more if we gave patients and communities of patients and caregivers the ability to participate in the design of the process, not just be subjects, not just be consulted about IRB requirements and ethical guidelines, but to be part of the design process. And ultimately, we've got to stop tinkering at the edges of the way we do things. We really need to stop investing so much money in changing things on the margin. We need to think very holistically about how we can truly disrupt, use new technologies to truly disrupt this process and create change.
Right. So we now have time for questions from the audience. If you'd like to come to the microphone. While people are thinking about the questions, I'd like to thank the last two discussions for their comments.
Hi, thank you, Michael, for mentioning the Forum for Collaborative Research. And it so fits in with all of the comments, and especially, Anna, your comments about the need to bring all of the stakeholders together in a safe space. And Marcus, you talked about the necessity to build trust. So the Forum for Collaborative Research was started as the Forum for Collaborative HIV Research. And as many of you know, HIV is really what sort of drove the regulatory agenda towards innovation in terms of the whole idea of the surrogate marker, accelerated approval, et cetera. So HIV virus load was one of the first surrogate markers to actually be validated. And that happened because companies were willing to come together to make sure this happened. Now, they didn't all throw their data together, but they followed a sort of common data analysis plan. And if after company was able to demonstrate that HIV viral load, whether it's the baseline viral load or the outcome after treatment viral load, was related very significantly to clinical outcome, which was new AIDS events or death, it became very convincing. So there was no formal biomarker qualification program. It was just basically looking at the evidence of all of these trials. At that time, I was in Frankfurt, Germany, and we actually set up I think it was one of the first EMR records. It was just our own in-house EMR, but it worked really, really well. And initially, physicians were very reluctant to actually participate in that because everyone had to kind of put in some upfront work to actually create this database. But once we had it created, it was this wonderful sort of embedded construct where we participated in all of the clinical trials for new ARVs. So we had the data from the patients that participated in clinical trials, but then also all the patients that were just in the standard of care. And we could kind of go back and forth and ask questions from one side or the other side. And that was really my initiation into this whole field of databases. And it was only 2,000 patients or thereabouts. But this interplay between randomized clinical trial data and, for the Frankfurt population, real-world evidence just became really, for us, a very, very powerful tool. And that then helped us also to provide data to validate viral load and to also help standardize how HIV drug resistance was being used as a baseline parameter. And all of those were then presented to FDA special advisory hearings and then incorporated. So, but what I wanted to then talk a little bit more about was the forum and this issue about building trust. So really the forum model is based on building trust between industry, patients, academicians, and regulators. And we work with FDA and European Medicine Agency both. And that model has become so successful that we now actually apply to 6 different disease areas, the latest one being PSC, which is a rare disease, where the use of data becomes really, really critical. And the idea of the totality of evidence for a rare disease where you have no regulatory path, you don't know how to actually measure the endpoint, because waiting for a liver transplant or liver cancer or any of the other horrible diseases associated with PSC, no company would actually enter the field and start developing drugs. So that's the latest one we have started, and it's just been really interesting to see how this model of you put the patients, the industry members, the regulators, and the academician, but really the patient voice all in one room. Everyone has an equal voice and can contribute to this discussion. It is really, really a powerful. So thank you for really raising that issue, both of you.
Thank you. Maybe go to the other microphone first and then back.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to something that Elliot said that really stuck with me, and in some ways he, in a very thoughtful way, sort of undercut the premise of this panel that it was planned for. The premise, and I'll be honest, was if we're still doing this, it must be good for somebody. This must be working for somebody. I mean, this is a mammoth industry, and somebody must be, doing pretty well by it for us to keep doing it. And Elliot said no. And actually, I heard, maybe not in exactly that many words, but kind of a similar thing from everyone in the panel, that, you know, this is not really working for anyone. And a lot more comments sort of about the gravitational pull of the old, the fear of the new, the nail which sticks up will be hammered down, all of those sorts of things. You know, more about that than about any sort of, you know, misaligned financial incentives. And, you know, when Elliot was saying that, the sort of image that came to my mind is the person standing on the burning boat looking down at the water and saying, looks pretty cold down there. And, you know, Elliot said in his nice, calm way, the boat is burning. So that, you know, I'd be interested in any of the panelists' thoughts about, you know, is that really true? This is not working for anybody. And if so, you know, how do we get the message out that the boat is burning?
And one of the what we heard is, I think, from academia, that the tradition is quite strong and that there remain incentives, right, for researchers to not take too many risks. And I think we also heard from you, Anna, about this, I guess, again, academic investigators serving as peer reviewers largely. So I think that might be an area where there's still some interest in maintaining the model.
And I'll say, I mean, one of the things Elliot said, I think it was Elliot that really resonated with me. My first company, Galileo, a super small startup. And by the way, when I'd say I've co-founded or founded 2 companies, it makes me sound way fancier and more successful than I am. So just keep that perspective in mind. But there were a couple of times where we were working with pharma companies where we had somebody who needed what we did. We were the only ones who could do it, who had the money, but a specific project and a deliverable that they needed to do with us, and we were the only ones who were capable of it, and we couldn't get procurement to return our telephone calls, period. So, I mean, there's a real disincentive in a lot of pharma companies, you know, in this case it was a pharma company, to, at multiple levels, and that's sort of what I was referring to. If you make it through to Francis Collins, then you have to make it through to the people at NCATS. If you make it through to Chris Austin, then you have to make it through to the reviewers. And I'm not saying that to pick on NIH or NCATS or anybody in particular, but there are lots of different layers of this battle, and it's exhausting.
Hui Chia from Novartis. I actually have a very relevant comment and have a question for panelists at the end of my comment. I very much echo Elliot and Brian talked about the internal challenges, and I very much appreciate the reality actually Dan described in your talk about what you see with your faculty, physicians in choosing the approach for their research. And I do think they are a result of a fixed mindset, and this fixed mindset is partially due to the grading of evidence, hierarchical level of evidence, or the grading of evidence that all of us were introduced to at the medical school, and we continue what the message was reinforced over and over in the clinical practice. So on my train ride coming here, I actually did a quick literature search using keywords like medical grading, evidence grading, hierarchical evidence. Then I read the 10 papers returned by, top 10 papers returned by PubMed. And it's just, you know, it's not surprising. Every paper lists the randomized control trial as level 1 evidence. And so in terms of, you know, real world type of evidence from cohort study, case control study, usually, you know, if in only one paper listed level 2. In most of papers, you know, listed level 4, level 5, you know, even below systematic literature review. I think we're comfortable with randomized clinical trial, as a lot of panelists put it out. It's standardized, we're familiar with, we know what we're getting, we know what it's good for, it's not good for. But if we truly want to create incentives, shall we revisit the, you know, the grading levels of evidence that were introduced many, many years ago? And at that time, you know, we didn't have a lot of the data available to generate real-world evidence, and we have little understanding of what can be derived from observational type of research. I mean, are we ready to revisit that the grading hierarchy. And if we raise the bar of the real-world evidence type of studies, as Joanne pointed out, and also build a standard process for doing that, shall we give the status of real-world evidence really deserves?
Can I just make one comment on this about the grading process? So one of the things I think that when we look at grading of evidence, sometimes we really think about the methods, and we really put a lot of emphasis on that from a grading perspective. What we often, I mean, there's some mention of it in terms of the data source, but I don't think we're rigorous enough on the data used, the data to which the methods were applied, right? So not every environment is fit for all purposes, right? So you can't take a database that you go buy from a data vendor and then try to do all types of research on it, because there's only so many things that's really been validated to be good for. What I don't think we're really good at doing is being rigorous on our own data, that all these different data sources. So is there a certification process that we define specific criteria for different types of research designs or different types of questions you want to answer or different disease states you may be focused on because of really critical endpoints you're trying to assess that are essential to answer the question accurately or to draw conclusions from? I think there's a lack of rigor on the data sources themselves, in addition to sometimes the immaturity of some of the methods, which I do think are getting better. And I think that's often what you see a reviewer look at this, and they don't trust the data source necessarily, because you can often torture a data source and it'll tell you what you want. So I think there's a balance in this that I think we really underestimate the importance of the data sources.
I partially agree. I do think real-world evidence got more scrutiny. I mean, we often ask, what's the reproducibility of the study we found from real-world data? You don't see the same level of scrutiny over a randomized controlled trial. I have seen many clinical trials cannot be reproduced in subsequent studies, and when they publish the results from the first set of the, randomized clinical trials, they did not really get a question that, can you reproduce your results in other trials? I do think there is a certain unfairness in judging real-world evidence.
So we have to probably, I don't know, Ellie, did you want to comment as well, or otherwise we have to?
I think that's the comment is a very good one. I do think that listening to Anna McAlister discuss her experience, that there are opportunities for us to make randomized trials more feasible, less burdensome, more pragmatic, and ultimately more relevant to the patient without diminishing the internal validity at all. And you gave a very good example when you discussed the ordeal of supplying patient-reported outcomes to trial that probably weren't actually very meaningful. What I think, sorry? Well, most people's aren't. I think that what we don't want to lose is the concept of randomization, which is, I think, really critical for helping us to determine whether or not a medicinal product works, particularly when in diseases where a relatively small effect size, say less than 50%, may be clinically meaningful.
As a patient, I also want to be clear, I don't think we need to throw the RCT out. I think it has a very important role and still needs to be part of our toolbox. I just think we're overusing that type of study. Why are we doing, phase 4 trials using RCTs with large populations? And I would need to go back and look at the figures, but there was an article published in Diabetes Care last year where it said that there were like 94,000 people that were currently enrolled in phase 4 cardiovascular outcomes trials for type 2 diabetes drugs, and there were almost 45,000 in the same type of phase 4 study for type 2 diabetes drugs, looking specifically for the lack of risk of increased cardiovascular events. So these had to be huge population studies. I mean, think about how difficult that is to enroll, to maintain. How much money did we spend on that? As a patient, I would rather each of those pharma companies spend money doing something else. But to your point previously, a lot of people made a whole bunch of money doing those studies, whether they're the CROs, whether it's the academic research institutions. Those people aren't bad people by any stretch of the imagination, but they made a whole bunch of money. So there's a vested interest on multiple levels of keeping things the way they are. patients don't have that vested interest. We actually would rather the money be spent better for things that truly matter.
Hi, Martin Gibson from Salford. I thought I was going to agree so much with Marcus as he was doing his presentation that my head was going to fall off. Because everything you said about trust, overvaluing of data, misadventuring, it's all exactly the same on our side of the Atlantic. People overvalue the data they have. Our general practitioners, when we first wanted to bring the data together in Salford, said you, the hospital, just want it so that you can sell it to people, and vice versa as well. And we have the same with our specialist cancer hospitals and everything. But there was a kind of sea change halfway through doing the Salford lung study where people suddenly went, oh, so that's what we're doing it for then. Because to your point, bringing all the data together gives you the value that you want. And I just wanted to make one other comment, which is a dangerous thing for me to admit to at this point, because I am actually an endocrinologist. I look after people with diabetes. And so I feel slightly nervous saying that in this particular environment. But diabetes is actually the poster child that brought this. You wouldn't have the Salford lung study without diabetes. The kind of stuff they do in Scotland grew out of diabetes. Because people with diabetes have to meet just about everyone in the medical profession and beyond, it's the perfect example of how we need to bring data together to see a holistic view of patient care. And knowing the data and understanding your local data is key to that. We did a study where we were trying to look at renal function and the development of anemia, expecting to see a clear-cut relationship. When we first did it, we didn't see anything. And the reason for that was unknown to us, which we later discovered. The lab method for creatinine had changed at 3 or 4 different points during the period that we were looking at. Once we put in the correction factors for that, not only did we see a clear relationship, but we saw that anemia was starting in diabetes much sooner than we'd previously envisaged. So I absolutely get what you're talking about, but we need to grow these systems for clinical care in order to make them useful for research.
Rory Collins, Oxford. I mean, in trying to make the case for the value of non-randomized study and databases, I think there's a danger of conflating the problems with the way in which randomized trials are being conducted now, driven, in my view, by ICH and the way in which the ICH GCP guidelines have gone way beyond their purpose, such that they are, for example, mandated by the European Union regulation for all clinical drug trials. They're mandated by Gates for all trials that he funds in developing countries. There's a conflation between the problems with the way in which they've been implemented and somehow with the process of randomization. And I think if you do that, you come up with a wrong solution. You say, well, we have to use a different methodology. Whereas I think the solution should be we should use the methodology differently. And that conclusion, I think, drives us to do more of what the FDA have been doing with the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative, and actually go back to first principles and ensure that we have randomized trials that are fit for purpose, and not have essentially a structure that is creating huge cost, wasting enormous amount of resources at the expense of patients, and instead streamline the approach to randomized trials. But I think it's very important to understand what the problem is if you want to get the right solution.
Any comments from the panel? I guess they're not mutually exclusive, right? So,
Hi, Rick Kuntz. I work for Medtronic, Chief Scientific Officer. You made half the points I was going to try to make, Dr. Collins, so I can be brief now. I think it's important to realize that in this journey, to answer Greg's question, it's not because we're being held by gravitational force of tradition. Believe me, we want to get to move to places where we can get cheaper data in the observational space. It's just really hard. So in our experience, we've been trying to do this for 5 or 6 years with very good medical healthcare systems. It is difficult. It is hard to be able to take unstructured repurposed data and repurpose it to something that normally you would spend a lot of time defining. So if we look at the axes of questions that require validity, that's going to be randomization, generalizability, more on the observational side. And then the other dimension is structured versus unstructured data. When you try to mix structured with generalizability and ask a validity question, you're not going to get it. And that's what the critical issue is. So I think this idea that we're not going there because we're so glued to traditional methodology, I think is wrong. I think the answer is we have to basically keep forging ahead and deal with the barriers at each little detail to try to make sure that we get high levels of ascertainment of the data. Missing data is really terrible. That we get some level of standardization, even if we can try to repurpose it to some method to get standards. And also to try to standardize the practice of medicine so we can make it a lot easier for us to actually try to not have to interpolate what someone said. We can try to make it much more easier to understand. There are really great observational methodologies for us to reduce confounding if the questions are right. But if you look at one example, the example of renal denervation, okay, this is a very exciting therapy that was going to reduce hypertension. All the observational studies said this was a fantastic result. Even an open label randomized trial said this was the best thing ever invented for hypertension. When we did the randomized controlled sham study, it showed it didn't work at all. So think about the many people that will be getting an expensive, potentially dangerous therapy for hypertension based purely on the ideas of anecdotal reinforcement in people's practices rather than the actual true results. Now, that sham study caused our company to recheck out the physiology and pathophysiological mechanisms, and now we've changed the therapy, and the preliminary data looks like we've got it right. We did another blinded controlled study. I think if we make the advancement and actually try to address this issue of hypertension and make some success, it's because we understood that we need to have a rigorous, valid study to be able to make that breakthrough therapy go through. Had we relied on observational and even open label randomized studies, we would have got it wrong. So it's horses for courses. You have to pick what you're trying to study and what you're trying to do. I think it's important to move forward to getting cheaper and existing data that can be repurposed. And we have a lot of interest to do that, but we just have to be able to make sure that we don't try to paint everything with one color and address the problems individually in detail at a time and keep going on, rather than conclude that all of us are deluded, that we don't want to move out of a traditional method of randomized trials.
Yeah.
I agree. When I first took this job 6.5 years ago, the mantra that we kept hearing as KP research directors was better, faster, cheaper. And we came to the conclusion most times we could give you 2, but not 3. And I think that's because everyone assumes that just observational databases are easy to use, easy to manipulate. They also assume that I think you just really described well, is that not every question, you have to find the right methodology to address each question. Some questions do require a randomized trial. Some questions can be answered through quasi RCT style studies. But it's also, as Marcus pointed out, you've got to make sure also that the database or the registry was originally constructed to address the issue that you're looking to address. I see this now a lot. One of the large databases we contribute to in Kaiser Mid-Atlantic is NA Accord, which is this large observational cohort of HIV databases from multiple health systems. And people sometimes forget what qualifies a patient for being put into that cohort. It's not just because you're HIV positive. You were HIV positive and started on an antiretroviral therapy. That's a very different question and a very different cohort than if you were just HIV positive. So you can't always use all these large cohorts to address all the questions. And I think sometimes that's also where we get hung up and where we trip over ourselves.
If I may, I'd just like to punctuate that point. I think there's a great desire to simplify all of this, that non-interventional research methods are going to save us tons of money and we can do everything with a large data system. But anyone that's ever worked with these data knows their complexity, understands a lot about what we can do wrong. And I think a lot of people in the methods communities, they spend lots of times about how do we get it right. And where are the situations where we can use it and where are the situations where we cannot. And I think that's why part of my comments were about elevating the awareness of these methods. So the impulse to sort of drive towards that as the solution and the potential replacement can begin to abate, because that's not necessarily going to work. And there are many situations like the one just presented and many others where there's a false premise there. But there are many situations where we can do rigorous non-interventional research to answer very important questions. And I think the more we all understand what those situations are, the better served we will be with real-world evidence in this new world that we're operating in.
John Birch with Mid-America Angels. A comment and a question. I would like to suggest that maybe a lot of the resistance to using real-world data, to the extent it comes from electronic medical records, is well warranted. And I think that a lot of physicians are influenced by their sense of that. And what I'm referring to is a variety of, most people are aware of many mistakes in the EHRs. And I recently learned that attempts to use EHR data or information from an EHR in court for liability cases and others have been thrown out because the data is just unreliable. And yet here we are using it for medical decision making. And yet it is not, EHRs are not in fact regulated medical devices, even though they meet the definition. So that's my comment. A question is this: one of the concerns that I've heard frequently about the quality of data from physicians about the quality of data in an electronic medical record is the problem of missing data, missingness. And I guess I'd just kind of like to hear if that is from the panel as to whether that's a big problem or maybe a problem that can be ignored. I mean, the missing data is not the data, what did it say? Missing data is not the data of missingness. It's not the data that, it doesn't really mean that it's not there, it just means that it's not there. And so that is one of the most important things I've been told that keeps electronic medical record data from being really, really reliable. You can curate everything, but you can't curate missingness. If someone was or wasn't there, you don't know. You can't confirm that just by looking at the data itself. And that strikes me as an enormous problem unless we can do something about that going forward to really using electronic medical record data.
The EMR data is different. Let's just put it that way. And you know, like when you say missingness, it's kind of funny, right? Missingness on a visit, maybe, but you also may have 5 visits in that month, and you can replace it in a different way. So it really is thinking about it in a different way. But I do have to highlight, I mean, it's not easy data to work with, and people have to start with that premise just because, you know, when you compare it to a randomized clinical trial baseline, 3 months, you just say, oh, that's so simple and nice to work with. I do think, though, we're a little bit like, to me, it's a little bit where the drug development paradigm, and then we're talking about observational methods. Well, that's not really how it works, right? I mean, the drug has to be there to use observational methods. So I think, you know, maybe if we focus a little bit more on this efficacy to effectiveness, right, which is that issue about those randomized clinical trials, you know, in the phase 3 or right before, which would talk about how restricted the patient eligibility should be, or else we got to talk about things outside of you know, medication, right? Because we do use a much more variety of design, and even that grading of evidence for, you know, devices, behavioral interventions, diagnostic strategies. There's a lot more variation in the evidence that's being used to, you know, to make decisions. So if we're sticking straight to the drug development paradigm, you know, it's one of the things I always tell you can't use observational data if nobody's taking or using the product.
But there is a lot of data that you could use to support drug development. I mean, you know, I've got my iPhone sitting here. It's been generating blood sugar levels every 5 minutes, you know, for the past, well, it's been on the iPhone for a couple years at this point, but I've had one attached to me for 6 years at this point. there's 6 years of longitudinal continuous glucose monitoring data that exists. Nobody's doing anything with it. It exists. And that kind of stuff could be way more relevant than hemoglobin A1C if I were doing a drug trial for a new type 1 or type 2 diabetes drug. And I don't think that there is enough use of that in the clinical trials just because it's messy. It's a lot more difficult to use and incorporate than hemoglobin A1C, which is super easy and quick, and everyone knows what it means.
Yeah, willingness to explore different outcomes and to look at change in trajectory because you have 6 years worth of data before you get randomized intervention to use it. I think those are all important considerations. That it is true people that do traditional clinical trials are tending not to want to move into that space to use the additional data that a lot more about what that patient was like before they entered the trial than just what they do on that entrance form.
I would say that there is intense interest in capitalizing on data from wearables. It's a new data form for us. So there's much that we have to learn about managing the data and understanding the data, but I think that there is intense interest in capitalizing on it.
Well, and I, as somebody who's lived with multiple data streams for many years, I mean, one of my soapbox issues is that if we really want to understand what that means, we need to get patients involved in understanding it and interpreting it, because we'll get it in context and can match it up with other measures that are established way faster than our clinicians. Not because our clinicians aren't brilliant, we just live with it. So that's why what we're building, the platform I'm building with Vital Crowd, is all around crowdsourcing the design of research and getting the broader population of individuals who are affected by a disease or treat people with disease in the community, getting them involved in actually designing the research protocols themselves.
Just building on Anna's comment and Elliot's, we found that in some cases the traditional paradigm of going to physicians as investigators and building your research network outward from that hub in terms of them identifying patients, one paradigm shift is doing it reverse and essentially using crowdsourcing and mobile devices to actually conduct research in a way that starts with the patient, who then consents in to identify physicians and other data channels where we could collect information to conduct both randomized research as well as observational research.
The best way to do that is to actually incentivize institutions to actually follow through with the federal mandate at this point, if you're getting incentive payments, to give patients access to structured data so that they could then be the brokers of their data and figure out who they want to give it to and to be able to donate that data to research. It would be a relatively straightforward thing to do. Everybody is supposed to be doing it at this point, but very few people actually do that.
So just a broad comment, and just listening to this, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge sort of where we are, the reality of where we are in terms of missingness, in terms of unreliability of data, maturing methods, resistance to change, all the things we've kind of talked about the entire day. But what I think is really important is to not lose sight of where we need to head, the problems we need to solve, and what ideal needs to look like. And if we focus on that, and then build a roadmap that gets us there, I think that's the key. I mean, we have to start where we are, because we just have what we are. We can't rush through it and just jump over to that new paradigm. We have to build our way through it, and I think that's really key. If we don't change, if we don't change the speed in which we generate relevant evidence and the cost point in which we do it, we're doomed to a system that's just pretty much what it is today. We're just going to move the rocks around a little bit and keep going and be at the same point. We really have to change the system, because the way it works today is woefully insufficient to answer the questions for all of us, for all of our family members that are experiencing the healthcare system, and all of those that we have a responsibility for taking care of in the system. So I think just don't lose sight of that, and make sure that all the bad stuff we're thinking about today is real, but then build toward where we need to go.
Felix, since since we have a few more minutes, but since there's nobody at the microphone after such an excellent comment, an uplifting comment, I think we might conclude, if that's okay, this panel. I think that this session was perhaps a little bit difficult at the end of the day because it was all about the obstacles, but I'm glad that we came back in the end to the important goal that we have, because if we can make progress, we can make people healthier and save lives.